Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, you'll learn how to create this quote carousel in React using React hooks and emotion, a CSS and JS library. If you want a quick recap of everything I cover in this course, you can check out the 1-minute rundown at the end of this video, and the timestamp is going to be linked in the description. If not, let's go ahead and dive into the full-length video. So if you watched some of my recent videos, it's no surprise that I'm going to be using Codesandbox.io in this tutorial. Now, if you've never heard of Codesandbox.io, it's an online code editor that allows you to create environments like React or Gatsby and a whole bunch of other ones with just a click. So you don't have to worry about setting anything up in your local machine. So this is great for tutorials, and we can just jump in and start writing the code as soon as possible. So once you sign up for Codesandbox, what you want to do is come over to the Create Sandbox button, and you could create a React app, but what we're going to do is use Gatsby, which is a React framework. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of Gatsby. I have some future courses coming out that goes really in depth to Gatsby. We're going to build a full project. And this video is actually inspired by just a small chunk of an upcoming project that I have coming out in the next couple of months. With that said, what we need to do is come over here and click on fork. And this is going to actually move this into our sandbox. And once this builds, we can then start, we'll actually see the project here. So I'm just going to jump forward into the video and wait for this build process to finish. All right, so hopefully that didn't take too long for you. And once we have this ready to go, the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and change this default name. So I'm just going to call it React Quote Carousel. And the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and just get rid of some of this boilerplate here. And we can go ahead and get rid of some of this stuff that we imported that we no longer need. Then I am just going to go ahead and save that. Come up to my components folder, and I'm going to create a new directory here. And I'm going to call this quotes. And the reason I create folders instead of just listing them like this is because as your project grows, you might have several types of quote components. So it's a good idea just to put those into a folder so your components folder doesn't get too busy. So once we're in this folder, I'm going to come over and create a new file, and we're going to create a quotes, or let's just call it quote.jsx. And now we have our project open here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and import React from React, and then we can just go ahead and write a simple stateless function here. So const quote, and I'm just going to write it as an arrow function, and then we can return, this will go ahead and just return a div for now. And then we can go ahead and export this at the bottom. So export default quote. And in this div, let's just go ahead and just write in H1, it says hello. And if we save that, we can then use this in our index. So let's just go ahead and import that. And it looks like Prettier made this a little cleaner. So let's go ahead and make sure we write this out like this. So we need a return. I want to use our layout, open and close. And then we can just go ahead and start writing out quote. And you can see that this auto import is here. So all we need to do is hit tab. That is then imported up here. So that saves us some time. And just close that and then save it. And now we can see that hello is being returned, which is coming from this component that we just wrote. So the next thing I want to do is I want to store the quotes in like an actual object within my component. And then we can just read off of those quotes when we're actually writing the return down here. So to do that, we can just come into our constant or component here and create another constant and call this quotes. And I'm just going to have that equal to an object. And the first key here is just going to be set to 1, or excuse me, not 1, but 0. And this is going to be another object with a couple values in it. And one of the values is going to be client, which is just going to be a string. And the next one is going to be quote, which is also going to be equal to a string. Then what I want to do is just go ahead and copy this. Then I just want to paste it. So I have 4, and then go ahead and rename these 1, 2, and 3. And once we have those three things in here, we're getting an error because we need to go ahead and add a comma here. Okay, and then we can just go ahead and fill this out with some dummy content. So I'm just going to write something like awesome client, comma, and then the name of the company. So like Acme Co. And then for the quote, I'm just going to take some dummy text here and paste it in. Now I'm just going to go ahead and skip forward and fill this out for the rest, but just skip forward in the video so you don't have to watch this in real time. So once we finish that, we now have 4 quotes here in this quotes object that we can then use down here in our return. Now, before we actually start putting together the return here to make this look more of like the quote that we want, I am going to use a React hook called useState in order to set the default quote here to the first one. And to do that, we just come down here and create another constant. And when you're using useState, you first create an array with 2 values. The first one is going to be the name of the state. So that could be anything. In this case, we're going to call it current. And then the name of the method that's going to change that. And a good naming convention is just to take this name and then put set in front of it. So not set method, but set current. And then you can set that equal to useState. And let's go ahead and type that out, useState. Hit tab to auto import that. And then we have a parentheses, and then we can set the default value here. And what we're going to do is we're going to access that object, so quotes, and then we want to get the first item off of it, which is going to be 0. So once we have that, let's just go ahead and just console log current. And if we save that, open up our console, we can see that we get this object down here with the client and the quote, and then we can use that information below. Now, the next thing we want to do is I want to go ahead and create another state value here called active. So let's do const active, set active. And this is going to help us keep track of what color the button should be. So if it's on the active quote, the color of that button should be darker than the other one. So this is what this state value is going to be used for. So again, we just do useState, and then we pass in the default value, which is, in this case, is just going to be 0. So we can save that. And the next thing we need to do is we can just go ahead and let's refresh this. I'm not sure why it's giving us a complaint. I'm not really sure what that's about, but so let's go ahead and save that. Okay, no errors there. And then we can come down and actually start using these values. So the first one, let's go ahead and just get rid of this header tag. I'm going to write a p tag. And then I'm going to write curly braces. We're going to do current. So we're getting that state value. And then we're going to get the value off of that object, which is going to be quote. And then let's go ahead and just copy this and paste it below. And then this time, instead of quote, we're going to get the client value. So let's save that. And there you go. Now you can see this data coming from this first quotes 0. We're getting the client name and company as well as the quote. All right, so we're off to a good start here. And the next thing we want to do is I want to create a div that's going to hold the circles down here that's going to allow us to toggle through the different quotes. So to do that, I'm just going to create another div. And then I want to create a span down here. Now, I could just create the number of spans that I need. So I know I need 4, so I could just do 4. But a more programmatic way of doing it is mapping over the quotes object up here. And then depending on how many things are in that array is how many circles we need to create. So this is just a more bionic programmatic way of doing this. And the way we can do this is we can use Object.keys. So if we write object, so capitalize Object.keys, what this is going to do is it's a method that's going to return an array of a given object's own enumerable property names. So what does that mean? So you can see here, this object has 3 key values. So 0, 1, 2, and 3. So what it's going to do is return an array with those values, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So that's 4 items. And it's going to then create 4 circles once we use the map function. So once we write Object.keys, and it should be object, not objects. So let's go ahead and make sure we write that correctly. Parentheses, and then we can pass in the object we want to loop over, or map over rather, and that's going to be quotes. So once we have that, we can write dot map parentheses, and then we're going to write an arrow function, and the value that we want to pass in is the index. And the index is just the position of the item in the array. So if it's the first thing in the array, the index is going to be 0, and then we can pass that information into the span here once we write that. So arrow function, and then parentheses, and here's where we're going to write the span. So let's do span. And I'm going to write an onClick event. So onClick. And this is going to pass in the event object as an argument. So event. And I'm going to call handleSetClick. So we haven't written this yet. We're just going ahead and go write that out, and we're going to pass in the event. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a custom HTML attribute. And we're going to use this in order to style the button depending on what the active state is. And the way you write custom data attributes is first by writing data, then dash, and then the name of the data attribute. In this case, we're going to call it quote. And we can set that equal to the index. Now you might think we're done, but in React, we need to create a key value once we're mapping over this, or React's going to complain. So we need to do key, and this needs to be a unique value. So we'll just use index here as well. Then we need to go ahead and close off this span. And everything's actually formatted right. It's just complaining because this doesn't exist. So let's make sure we just refresh this. And let's go ahead now and actually set that handle state so that goes away. So let's come up here and write that method here. So const handleSetClick. And for now, we can just do an arrow function, and it's just going to console.log hello. So there we go. So it should now stop complaining. All right, so once we do that, we're currently, we're not getting any errors, so it's working. We just don't see anything because we haven't styled the span yet. And the way we can, we're actually going to be handling styling in this course is actually using something called emotion. Now, emotion is it's a CSS in JS tool that essentially does what it sounds, right? You're allowed to use CSS and JS, so why would you want to do this? For one, you don't have to worry about naming your classes. You just pass them into your component, and you also can use variables within your CSS, which we're going to be using with the state values, which is a really cool feature of CSS and JS frameworks like Emotion. Now, in order to add a dependency here in Codesandbox, what we need to do is come over and click on Add Dependency, and we're going to be using Emotion here. So let's just type that in. The first one here with 3.5 million downloads or stars or whatever it is the one that we want to add. And then we can just go ahead and import it up here. So import, and what we want to import is CSS, CX, and that's going to be from Emotion. All right, so once we save that, we can now start using this to style our objects. All right, so now let's come down to the first div here, which is going to be the entire wrapper here. And what we want to do in order to start using Emotion is just use class name like you would, and then in the curly brackets, we can write or access this CSS value that we just passed in. So it's CSS and then with 2 backticks. And then in between here, we just write standard CSS. So we can say display. We're going to set that to flex. So if we save that, you'll see that these items should now be side to side. So, all right, so now that we added that display flex, you can see now that they're side by side, and we can fix that by changing flex direction to column. Oh, flex direction. There we go. Okay, and then what we can do is align items. So this is another flexbox parameter. We can center those. So now you can see that this is now centered on this div. And we can just go ahead and add a little bit of margin here. So margin, top and bottom of 40 pixels, and then auto on the left and right. So it's going to be centered on our website, and we can set a max width here to something like 700 pixels. All right, so what we could do is we could essentially do the same thing here with these p tags, but you can actually go ahead and style, direct descendants of this div by just accessing them like this. So just like you would in CSS, we can write, instead of div p, we just write p. And then we can add some styles here. So we do text align, center. So that's going to see the quote you're going to see is going to become center aligned. We can add some margin bottom here. Let's do 20 pixels. And we can set a color here to a custom hex code. And there we go. Now we have styled the descendants of, or the children of this div right here. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the styling here. And the next one is going to be this div. So again, we do class name equals curly brackets, CSS, 2 backticks, and then we can start writing our CSS right here. And again, I'm going to use display flex. So this is going to be the container for our span circles. So display flex, you're not going to see anything once I save that because we still need to style the spans. And just like the p tags above, we can style the spans by just writing them out like right here. And here we can set a height, 20 pixels, the width to 20 pixels, a margin, top of 0, and then do left and right of 3 pixels, display flex on this as well, align items, center, justify, content is going to be center as well. And the reason I haven't saved this and showed you, because you're not going to see anything, because so I'm just going to save that and show you. You can see, again, nothing has changed because what we're going to be using is the before pseudo class in order to actually create the circles within this span. So this span is kind of just acting as a container. That's 20 by 20 pixels. We're then using display flex in order to center that here on this square that we just created right here. And once we hover over this span, we're going to get a pointer indicating that we can click this item in order to change it or have something happen, which in this case is change it to a different quote. So now let's go ahead and use that span before in order to add some content here, which is going to be for our dots. So span before. And here we can do content. Is this equal to an empty string? And now here's where the magic happens, where we're going to actually start seeing this circle. So 6 pixels. Set a width here to 6 pixels as well. So let's go ahead and save that. We should see something show up here. Oh, let's set, I know what it is. We need to set a background color. And we'll do just D4. There we go. And now we can see little 6 by 6 pixel squares, which if we come in and inspect this, and we can pull this down so we can actually see. So you can see the span here, it's 20 by 20. And within here, we have this before pseudo class of 6 pixels, which is centered here in this 20 by 20 pixel square. So right now it's a, it's a square, which, if you're digging that, you can keep it like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a border radius to this. So border radius of 50%. And then we can see that those turn into circles. And I'm actually going to add a transition here as well, which is going to handle the color change. So, once we hover over it, it could just change color instantly, but in order to kind of make it a little smoother and more organic, we can actually add an ease to that. So an ease motion. So in order to do that, we do transition, then the name of the value that we want to add this to. So that's going to be background color, because that's what's going to change. How long the animation is going to be, so 0.3 seconds, and then we can write ease, which is the value or the type of style of the animation. Now you can do ease in and out, or just ease out, but I think ease in this case looks nicer. So let's go ahead and save that. And now you can see if we hover over these, we get the pointer indicating that we can click on these. And if we actually click on it, we should get a console.log, because remember we wrote that code. So let's go ahead and just click on that. We can see console or hello's printing down here in our console. Now nothing's changing because we haven't written the logic for that yet. But let's go ahead and finish the hover class or hover style here. In order to do that, you might think we do, span before hover. Well, that's not the right way of writing it. We actually write it like span hover and then before, like this. And we can set a background color here to the following hex code. And now once we hover over this, you can see it change to the darker color. So the next thing we want to do is you want to write a style that looks at the value of the data quote, which is set to the active state that we wrote before. And depending on if it's 0, 1, 2, or 3, is going to change the color here of which one is actually active. So this is the logic that's going to style the one depending on which one is set active in the state. So what we do is write span, and then like an array, we do the brackets, and then we say what the attribute that we want to set or check what its value is. So data quote is equal to, and here we can access the active state value by just writing it like this. And we need to make sure that is on the before pseudo class. And depending on what, if it is active, we want to set it here to the same color. So let's just go ahead and copy this background color. And once we save that, what should happen? Just think about it. And if you said this should be dark, you're right? Because the active class up here is set to 0, which means that the value down here, the span where the data quote is equal to 0, which is the first thing here, should be dark. So let's just go ahead and save that. And once that updates, you can see now the first object is dark, which means that this is working. So now what we need to do is we need to come back and write the logic here for our handleSetClick, because right now it's just console logging hello. So what we do in order to change the state, we use these setCurrent and setActive methods or these values that we wrote up here. And the logic that we want to write here is actually pretty simple. Now, what we do, remember we're passing in the event object, so we need to write that up here. So this method knows that we're passing this in, and we want to use it in our actual code here. And what we first want to do is run setCurrent, and we just do that with the parentheses. And what do we want to set this to? Well, we want to set it to the value of the data quote. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the current value. And this is going to be equal to whatever the data quote is. So let's come in here and look at this really quick so it makes a little more sense. So you can see here that we have data quote 0, 1, 2, and 3. So once we click on this span, we're going to send this data quote. We have access to it through the event object of like, hey, this value is 1. Set it to the array value or the second item here in our array. Remember, 1 is actually the second item in the array. So it's going to say, okay, cool. You want it to set it to this. And oh, look, this is the client and quote values that we're using down here in these p tags. So once that state changes, it's also going to change here and be reflected. So let's go ahead and write that here. So we do quotes, and we want to set it equal to the event dot target. And on this target, we can use something called getAttribute. The attribute we want to get is the one that we wrote, the data quote. So if we save this, so once we click on those spans, we should now get the quote and the client changing, but the active class isn't going to be working just quite yet. So if we click on this, we can see that we can cycle through the different values. All right, so now we just need one more thing, which is the logic for the set active. So set active, and this is going to be event target, get attribute, and same thing, data quote. So let me just kind of explain what this is doing. So it's going to change the set active. It's going to set it to the number here. So instead of setting it to 0, it's going to either be 0, 1, 2, or 3. And this active is being used down here in the CSS, remember. So once that changes, this value changes, which changes this this logic here saying that, hey, wherever data quote equals 0, 1, 2, or 3, make that span dark black. All right, so let's save that and test out this logic. So once we click on this, this should stay black and the other one should change back to the light gray. Create a Gatsby project in Codesandbox and then create a quote component. Then store the quotes as an object inside the quote component. Next, create current and active state values using the useState React hook, setting defaults to the first quote and 0 respectively. Now display the quote and client strings in the component by accessing the values from the current state. Next, create an array of the keys in the quotes object by passing the object into the Object.keys method. This will return an array with 4 values, 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now use the map method to map over each value to create the 4 dots we need. The dots will be wrapped within a span element, and each span element will need an onClick event handler that calls the handleSetClick function, a custom data attribute, and a key. To style the component, we'll use Emotion, a CSS and JS library, so add it as a dependency and import it into the component. First, style the wrapping div and paragraphs. Then style the dots wrapper and span elements. The span element will act as a wrapper for each dot, and the dots will be created using the before pseudo element in CSS. Next, create a CSS attribute equals value selector, setting the value equal to the active state value. This will make the dot darker when its data quote attribute value is equal to the active state. Last, create the handleSetClick method by passing in the event object and getting the data quote attribute value by using the event target getAttribute method. Now use the attribute value and pass it into the setActive and setCurrent functions to update the state values. And that's it. Now we have a React quote carousel. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And be sure to check out our other design and web development courses on our YouTube channel and on skillthrive.com. Again, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and I'll see you in the next video.